Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You ready to get started? My name is Claudia Holland, and I'm head of the Copyright and Scholarly Communication Office at George Mason University, our alma mater, right? I welcome you today, and I'm just going to introduce you to these guys and tell you a little bit about open access in the event that you're not familiar with it. Over the past 10 years or more, the open access movement has gained momentum in drawing attention to the fundamental need of the world community to have free and immediate online access to research. The benefits to scholars and consumers alike are too numerous to mention in the limited amount of time I have today, but Mason faculty member Michael Gilmore in New Century College offers these comments. One of the things that pains me the most about publishing in a traditional journal that isn't open access is that it's very difficult and expensive for people in Peru, where I conduct my research, to access the article. This is unfortunate because the data and ideas within the publications may be most important for scholars and practitioners in Peru, as they're the ones working on the ground. Makes sense? In short, I think it's ethically questionable to publish in places that people in host countries cannot access and use freely. Publishing open access has increased readership of my work, increased the numbers of people citing my work, and has provided open and free access to people in Peru where I conduct my research. Today, members of the GMU Forensics Team are speaking, among other topics, on the impact open access resources can have in learning environments and on students. Directed by Communications Professor Peter Pover, the Forensics Team is an intercollegiate speech team representing George Mason at regional and national speech competitions. Briefly, forensics is public speaking, for those of us who don't know, and oral interpretation of literature, with events designed to focus on each of the ways the spoken word can be used to persuade or move an audience. In the course of their preparation, student team members do huge amounts of research, putting them in a unique position to discuss topics of open access in the context of universities. Individually, our four presenters today have all had national competitive success. Awesome, guys. Nathan Lays is a sophomore in the Honors College from Des Moines, Iowa. He is a limited preparation events captain for the Forensics Team, a speech and debate coach for Trinity Prep High School in Winter Park, Florida, and an intern with the National Speech and Debate Association. Nathan, would you introduce your fellow members?
Sure. So to my right, which is your left, this is Ian Birdwell. He's a senior on the Forensics Team, and he originally hails from Norfolk, Virginia. On my left, immediate left, is A.K. Cohen-Dury. He's from Sterling, Virginia. He's a junior and was my predecessor as the LP captain. And to my far left is Samuel Abney. He's also a junior, originally hailing from Phoenix, Arizona, who plans to get his JD after school and enjoys long walks on the beach. That's it. So we're going to just go from your left to your right, starting with Ian, discussing issues of
peer review. All right, so everyone is aware that peer review takes place in scientific journals as well as social sciences journals to ensure that the research is legitimate and ethical. But there are a host of problems with the double-blind process that's in use within the humanities and social sciences that aren't readily present in other parts of research. For instance, the sciences, the hard sciences in particular, such as physics, chemistry, biology, don't utilize the double-blind process, which means the reviewer knows exactly who the other person is who they're reviewing the work of. And that leads to a slew of problems within the hard sciences. Particularly, it leads to a lack of minorities getting research published, ranging from women to ethnic minorities across the country and across the world. And in addition to that, it leads to the leaders of prominent scientific journals becoming more and more whitewashed, with straight heterosexual males getting those positions because they're often correlated and only applicable to people who've been published in multiple journals. And that leads to a lot of problems that the double-blind process sought to solve. But the double-blind process has a host of issues as well. because the double-blind process has no time constraints on research. Meaning if I write a research paper relating to like squirrels and how much nuts they eat in a year, and Nathan reviews it, he could hold on to that research for up to a year or 6 months. Meaning my research itself is stalled because I'm not getting comments back quickly, which means I can't get it published as quickly. Meanwhile, my paper could be used by Nathan to fuel his own research into squirrels and their eating habits. And that's a giant problem in the scientific community, as well as in the social sciences, because it's kind of like promoting plagiarism, which is really not cool, especially in regards to works that will be published. And it leads to a lot of problems within the academic community. But open access is trying to fix that by taking models from social media and things like Google Docs. So a big thing to reform peer review process within open access is taking research and putting it into online forums. So essentially, instead of me emailing my article to a blind peer review session and the person reviewing it over a course of a few months and sending back research, it's instead being posted online under a forum name or username of some sort, and people look at the article, comment on it, send me back critiques. And that opens up so much more opportunities for effective research, because not only does it ensure that I can choose what I'm seeking to do in the paper, whether it be have groundbreaking research or just simply analyze statistics related to something like squirrels, political efficacy, or any form of chemistry experiments, but it also gives me the ability to actually directly question those that are peer reviewing me for clarification on comments, new ideas. And it also provides a great incentive for people to actually peer review, because the double-blind process doesn't really encourage active peer reviewing. You can sit on it for a few months and do it last minute and get it back and have no repercussions against you as a reviewer of an essay. But under this new forum-style method that's more akin to Google Docs than the double-blind process, you can actually get a more active discussion going between two members of a community and get more knowledge actually being exchanged. And that translates into great stuff for us as students because it leads to more articles being published, better articles being published, that we can use to both fuel our own academic success outside of the classroom as well as inside of the classroom if we seek to translate it into writing papers and essays. But beyond that, another giant problem within the peer review process, particularly in the hard sciences, is the replication of data. So MIT has research opportunities and capabilities that other universities across the country and the world don't have. And if they want to get a paper published, other universities can't really replicate it. But by opening up in like an online forum space, you can reveal everything to everyone, so people who can replicate those experiments can actually successfully do so. So that gives you a great opportunity to start a conversation with those who are actually your financial equals in dealing with experiments for the hard sciences. And a great example of this is the Public Library of Sciences decided to change its peer review process in 2005 to, instead of pushing for just strictly groundbreaking research, to just scientifically astute and ethical research, led to thousands of more articles being published by switching their review process, the style of review, and it led to so many more articles being published that it actually dropped the cost of the journal. And by translating it into open access, you're looking at thousands of more articles being published than are currently being published.
So after each presentation, we're going to do a brief question and answer session. So does anybody have any questions for Ian about peer review and open access? Yes.
I'll go for it. In the academic world, the prestige of the journal in which you are published often has a significant weight. Whether we like it or not, many of the open access journals don't have that prestige. So to encourage an academic to publish in a journal like that could be detrimental to her or him, given the weight it would be given should they be going through tenure or trying to use it for an advancement between an associate and full professor. How might the open access journals assuage that concern such that the rigor became perceived by others as much more substantial?
Well, by opening up open access peer review for journals works. it could be a very prestigious person trying to, or just anyone trying to translate from associate professor to full professor, get the input of not just one reviewer who may not be that prestigious or have works published in prestigious journals. But you could get, for instance, big names in the community, whatever academic community it may be, commenting and reviewing that article, whether it be under a false name or they're actually putting the name out there on the website that the forum is using. In doing so, you can establish a dialogue that adds credibility to the journal because of the people discussing and reviewing and publishing. So it's shifting credentials off of the journal itself to the person.
Could you go into a little more detail or maybe clarify your comment about why single blind reviews leads to less publishing by ethnic minorities?
Okay, so that's actually a problem within the hard sciences more so. So oftentimes the board of journals, like let's say for instance Nature as a journal, will have a board of directors that will review work and approve what's going to be published in the journal. More often than not, those people are going to be white heterosexual males. And actually there's an article published in Nature that discusses the inherent biases we as individuals have when we're reviewing articles. And it's not so much a problem within the double-blind process, but in non-double-blind processes, where you're actually aware of the person's name, that leads to problems. Because, let's say Joe Schmo is reviewing an article from Jane Schmidt. If that person has some inherent biases against women, they might be translated into the review process, where they might be overly critical of that research. And removing the names attached to them and instead putting in like Professor X227 and Professor B38 might remove that process and encourage more open discussions. By having more than one person review it, you decrease the ability of a paper written by a minority being torn apart by someone unknowingly or with malice in heart.
Other questions for Ian?
So one of the traditional benefits of double-blind peer review is that it gives the author some feedback before publication to improve the paper or book without it being open to the public, open to critique. And so, I think the experiments in open peer review are interesting, but possibly one of the downsides of it is opening up papers to public view that really aren't ready for that yet, that could still be improved.
That is a concern, but on the flip side of that, with the double-blind process, if you wrote a paper and I was reviewing it, there's no time constraints. So I could be reviewing it for up to 6 months or a year, which means your research isn't being furthered, you're kind of just sitting and resting on laurels, and you don't know how to improve the paper anyway. By translating it into an open access environment, you can encourage and actually get more people reviewing the work, which could lead you to getting it published faster and get it up for publication faster. So it's a trade-off.
If you're in the back just because of sound concerns, do you mind coming up to stand next to the camera to ask the question? Thanks.
In an open peer review process, how do you assure the competency of those that are reviewing the paper?
Well, of all the open access review processes that have been going on with open access journals using that method, you have to be able to prove your credentials at a university. So, I wouldn't be able to review actual papers if I didn't have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or I wasn't an expert in that particular field.
All right.
But to provide a foil to that, Peter could, which could enable him to research and look at all the other communication articles, any article he could really get his hands on to help improve that article.
So then how do you come to an agreement on what assures you as being an expert in that field, as in assuring that the person who's peer reviewing is accurately competent? Who draws those lines of...
It would depend on the publication. It would depend on the actual open access journal itself.
Okay.
Some might be less constricting, some might be more constricting. It depends on the publication.
All right. Thank you.
All right, so to keep this moving on, we're going to go in 15-minute blocks of a presentation and then about a 5-minute Q&A session. So I guess I'm next in the left to right order. I'll be covering briefly textbooks, open access, and how that impacts low-income students. So who here has textbooks and had to buy them earlier this year? That was terrible, right? Like you look at the cost and you're like, oh my god. And then if you're like me, you call your parents and ask them to buy them. And it turns out, but textbooks, the average cost of textbooks to a university student every year is $1,200. The College Board says that price is rising 3 times the price of inflation. In the last 3 decades, the cost of textbooks has gone up 800%. A lot of this is because there just isn't a lot of competition in the market. 5 publishers of textbooks have 85% of the market cornered, and that's in every field. So you've got the big names like Pearson and Wiley, who have functionally no transparency in their pricing. They have functionally no competition of people who could produce textbooks of similar quality. There's all kinds of relationships between universities who are used to buying from Pearson or Wiley. And this is exemplified in new editions. So you might have to buy a new edition of a history textbook every 3 years, but the history of the 19th century doesn't change every 3 years. There's all sorts of controversy over that about new editions and how expensive they are that I'm not going to go into right now. Now, the price of textbooks obviously is bad for all students, and the fact that it's rising so astronomically and stratospherically. But it especially hurts lower income students, who a lot of the time are an overlooked population at universities. So we have this idea of the traditional bachelor's degree as being a 4-year experience. But for a whole lot of students, the 4-year education is a myth. It takes a lot longer. And for poor students, it tends on average to take longer. First of all, they're less likely to complete a degree at all. And if they do complete a degree, it usually takes them longer because on average, lower income students have to work more often than higher income students to pay for college. And the jobs mean that they can take fewer credits per semester. So you might be a lower income student having to go, 6 years in order to get your bachelor's, in which case that's an extra $2,400 on average in textbook costs. Now there are some statistics on the poverty of college students that are pretty incredible. So who lives off campus but not with your family? Of college students who live off campus but not with your family, 51% are below the poverty line. 29% of students have incomes below $20,000 a year. So just to put this in perspective, if you have an income of $20,000, you would spend on average 6% of all of your income for an entire year just on texts that you are required to buy for class. Not on tuition, not on transport or food or gas, just on textbooks. 6% of your income is just gone. And for that reason, between about 2/3 of students have state that they have decided not to purchase a required textbook because of the cost. And the exact number depends on if you're asking the Government Accountability Office or if you're asking other researchers. But generally between 65 and 70% of students just decide that they're not going to buy a required text. And overwhelmingly, those same students say they know it's likely that their grade is going to be impacted negatively as a result. And so that's especially likely to happen for low-income students who need that money, whether to support their families, whether it's to be able to buy food or pay insurance, which means that low-income students are more likely to not have the text they're required to get good grades in class. That compounds all of these issues. Now, just to put all of that discussion about how much textbook costs hurt low-income students, $1,200, the average cost of textbooks for a year, is 4 months worth of groceries for a college-age individual. So open access is so important because the idea of open access is that it's open. It doesn't have this giant great wall of money between you and the information you're trying to get. So there is a program, probably the most important and well-known program, is the University of Minnesota's Open Textbook Library. And this includes Minnesota, Purdue, Cal Poly, Oregon State, Cleveland State, and a couple of other schools. And what the Minnesota Open Textbook Library is, or the OTL, it's this program wherein experts, highly qualified, the best in their fields, write textbooks, post the PDFs online, and then encourage other professors around the country to download the textbook, edit it to make it specific to their course, and are like, you can contact the original author if you want comments on it. And it doesn't cost anything to the students, besides the cost of printing, which, while expensive, not as expensive as $1,200 a year. And it's an unlimited license, right? So the same principles that allow the internet to flourish of having like computer code just be posted to the internet, be customized and put back, that's essentially the idea, except it's textbook information. So there's already a couple of examples of kind of open access learning. So Khan Academy, you've heard of Khan Academy before? If anybody like used it to try to learn like long division, which I still don't know long division, but Khan Academy taught it to me before, I forgot again. It's interactive, it's open access, there's lots of fun activities, you can like chart your progress, it's super flashy. And there's a lot of interesting research into how Khan Academy is being used instead of like traditional paper textbooks. There's the Pirate Bay or Tor, where people steal textbooks. Like I'm sure no one in here has ever stolen any data ever of any kind. But more and more students, not in this room, are stealing PDFs as alternatives to buying them. Which, you know, if you're a student and you have the choice of either like failing a class and having to drop out of university, or like anonymously downloading the textbook and using that to do your homework, that doesn't mean that it's like legal or even ethical, but it's easy to understand why it happens. The idea behind like University of Minnesota's program is that open access textbooks are better than like Wikipedia or Yahoo Answers because they're, you know, freely accessible and you can get to them legally, and they're also written by people who know what they're talking about. Like, has anyone ever actually tried to use Yahoo Answers? You get the most ridiculous responses. You can be like, who is the president? And then the answers are like, well, it probably means you have throat cancer. Like, the things that go on there are absurd. Or like Wikipedia, right? Like you hear the concerns about like, well, Wikipedia is just as accurate as like the Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, that's debatable, but like a month ago, somebody edited Mitch McConnell's Wikipedia page to say that he's actually a turtle and is therefore the first senator to actually not be a human. Like Wikipedia might be a little bit too open access in that regard, and that while like you can freely access it, it's not just experts who are editing it. So the idea behind open access textbooks, the open access holy grail for textbooks: electronic, interactive, professionally developed, legally required, and most important, free. Going back to low-income students, I mean, the advantages are huge. It's easier to stay in school. If you have to, you know, work from home, then electronic textbooks help with distance education. They're more interactive, making courses potentially more flexible. And of course, you can afford to buy groceries. But that doesn't mean that there aren't potential downfalls. So the first one is the digital divide. You know, we were all like taking selfies on our smartphones before you all got here, and it's kind of just like normal to assume that everybody in college has a laptop, has a cell phone. But of people making less than $20,000 a year, which is again 29% of students, only half of them have access to broadband at home. Only 70% have access to the internet at all. That's from the Pew Research Center. So Bowker Market Research, of 72% of people who use open access textbooks, they do so on their laptops or on their iPads. It doesn't really work on a mobile phone, which most low-income students have. But like laptops and iPads are not cheap either. So we can have the information be free. You can freely access it. But we may just end up using this rhetoric of making this free and available to everyone, and then denying people the platform for which to access that. There's also new research from the University of Connecticut that lower income students, because they've had less exposure to the internet earlier on, are less able to find and comprehend information they get online, raising the specter that we might end up scaring people off of higher education altogether. You also get concerns about premium content. So there are big publishers like of e-textbooks like Pearson reports 50% of their revenue comes from digital sources. The professors making open access textbooks don't get paid, obviously, because it's an open license. If there's a model that can correct that, it might emerge in the future, but in the status quo, that's how it is. So let's take the Khan Academy, which on like their front page promises to always be free. The worry is that that follows the Spotify model, that it starts off free, but then it starts offering premium content to people who can pay for it. So while, yeah, there might be some open access resources available to everyone, the good content might be available to those who can pay, which means that we're stratifying open access and electronic education based on income, re-entrenching the same issues. And then there are some issues with physical textbooks versus e-textbooks. I'm going to try not to tread on Sam's talk later. But study after study shows that people prefer physical text. So one alternative is to have the electronic text for free, and then the physical text as an optional but more expensive alternative. And while the research so far isn't very conclusive, and again, I don't want to tread on Sam, if people are better able to comprehend and prefer physical textbooks, the poorer students can't afford physical textbooks, then there's a possibility that we're lowering comprehension for poor students. And again, going back to the same issues. So open access resources have immense potential for low-income students. I mean, they really do. And something has to be done about textbooks creating this ivory tower in and of themselves to work outside the classroom. But care has to be taken to make sure that the open access textbook revolution doesn't end up re-entrenching the same issues that it's seeking to solve. So Nathan, would you like to say some questions now? Yes, I will. All right, questions?
So what about resale of textbooks? How does electronic format affect resale of textbooks?
Yeah, that's another thing. So a lot of students sell their textbooks back to the book. That's especially true if you buy it from a campus bookstore. You can sell it back at the end of the year and get like between $2 and like $100 back. Usually much less than the price of the textbook. And a lot of times when you have to get a new edition every year, that's even more problematic. But with electronic textbooks, you get no resale value at all. Like you can't sell it back because you didn't buy it, and also anybody can buy it for free. There's no resale component to electronic textbooks. So a lot of the research that I found states that that may be a problem, but overall poor students would be coming out ahead because if you buy a textbook for like $100 and sell it back for $15, you've lost $85. Compared to an electronic textbook where you can't sell it back, but you didn't pay anything for it in the first place. So you're still $85 richer at the end of the semester.
Do you know what the percentage is of students that buy textbooks as opposed to Chug or something rental?
Off the top of my head, it's gone up from like 0% in like 2005 to I think like, are you talking about the proportion of textbooks or like the number of students who rent textbooks?
Whether people are buying them or renting them, which happens more now.
Yeah, it's several times higher than it was just like a decade ago of renting. And the number of people who use electronic textbooks as well has just like skyrocketed as well. But again, I don't want to put on
And there's
Sam's.
used book market too. So a couple of comments. I'd like to know what you think about them. First of all, professors, they choose textbooks for better or for worse, not based on price or affordability, but in theory, they try to pick the best textbook available for their class. So it doesn't really have a bearing on the professor whether it's open access or not. Now some professors are starting to change that, but overall, most professors, they just want the best textbook available, which would, in theory, improve student learning. So maybe you could comment on that. But one other thing is that a lot of times when you talk about textbook publishers, the publishers are kind of seen as money-grubbing, monopolists. And the truth is that most textbooks lose money. Some textbooks make a lot of money. But overall, publishers and textbook publishers are not huge profit-making beasts. Like Cengage declared bankruptcy a couple years ago. Pearson's struggling in many ways, trying to reinvent themselves. So I think the cost of textbooks that the students sees is very high. It's true, and it has gone up a lot, but it's not at the profit of publishers.
Yeah, so I'll take that one at a time. The issue with quality, the University of Minnesota actually comments on that, and other programs that are similar do that as well. So part of it is that they encourage collaboration between the original author and the professor, so the professor can fine-tune the text so that it's the best one available for their course, that it's so customized, that there's so much like work with the original author that you don't have to choose between static items. And then regarding professors choosing based on quality and ignoring the cost, to a large extent that's true. Surveys show, however, that like you said, an increasing number of professors are starting to change. And then you've got movements across the country from like UC Santa Barbara to like Georgetown and Duke, of student government, of other student associations, asking professors to look at the price as well as a consideration. And there's some anecdotal evidence that that's starting to happen. But the big gains would come if professors moved to open textbooks and were able to customize those textbooks to be the best resources available to them. Regarding publishers not all being like Standard Oil and trying to rob the poor students of America, that's absolutely true, and I don't think that this is a change that can happen without them. Like I mentioned, Pearson already gets 50% of its revenue from electronic textbooks. It's going to take their infrastructure, it's going to take their resources to make this feasible, to provide the IT support. We all know, well, the government couldn't even roll out a healthcare website, then open access can't roll out an e-textbook revolution on a shoestring budget. They need the resources and the IT departments of those big publishers as well. But at the same time, you know, when you have 5 companies with 85% of the market, anybody from the econ department here will tell you that meets the generally accepted definition of a monopoly, and there are problems that go along with that.
It sounds like, you know, I'm a professor and I rely on updated textbooks, because I can't imagine trying to update my own textbook or edit it, and it seems like that would take a tremendous amount of time, and I don't see that very feasible, because I rely on an updated textbook where a lot of, you know, time has been spent to update that on a lot of areas that I don't necessarily know about. I might teach about it, but I rely on the book being updated and getting exposed to those new ideas. So, so I find it kind of perplexing to rely on professors to update the textbooks. Can you address that issue, maybe?
Yeah, and that's where a lot of having the open license comes in, that ideally you'd have more and more professors helping to write textbooks as well, so that it would be, for example, the basic econ 101 textbook on the University of Minnesota's library, I believe it's written by some expert from Georgetown. The idea is that the Georgetown expert would be the one updating most of the content, not necessarily like an overworked professor. And then the professors would be able to take that textbook, change anything they don't like after they've read through it, and customize it, but most of the major revisions to keep it up to date would be done by the authors, so that we're not asking like a basic outline to be posted. The University of Minnesota doesn't like post outlines and ask teachers to fill in all the blanks. They allow teachers to customize textbooks that have already been updated for them.
What is the incentive for the author?
The incentive for the author? So honestly, so far a lot of them are doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. If open access really takes off, then a big incentive is getting your name out in hundreds of classrooms around the country. If some government money comes up for paying people to write textbooks in order to lower tuition or cost to students drastically, I think that's a viable alternative. It's not in the works, but it could work. So there are a variety of financial and non-financial needs. I think we have to move on to AK so we can get all you out in here and schedule.
Hi, I'm AK. So I'm going to be kind of branching off on what Nathan talked about in terms of open access and textbooks. And a key issue we're going to be talking about is how traditional textbook and publishing models present certain controversies that maybe the open access revolution can assuage. So to start out, let's define what open access textbooks are. They're an openly licensed textbook offered online by the authors. And they are set apart from traditional textbooks because it allows the users to read online, download PDFs, download an audiobook format for little or no additional cost. And another big issue with open access right now, as Nathan just pointed out with the question, is that there's really not that big of a budget right now, and the majority of the funding coming is essentially philanthropic. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation donated $5 million towards the promotion of open access across the country. So while in theory it does sound, it's fantastic and it can definitely have myriad of improvements for traditional textbook publishing models and controversies, there are some issues currently with how open access is being assimilated into the learning environment. So across the board, there are 4 major controversies associated with traditional textbooks, some of which have been kind of advanced over already. So we have rising costs, first of all. We have access issues. We have modernization problems, and we have publishing controversies. And I'll be getting to all of them in a more specific detail. So first of all, as Nathan mentioned, textbooks are incredibly expensive, right? Especially at the beginning of the semester when we all have to buy our textbooks. Costs come to anywhere between $250 to like $500, $600 even, per textbooks, depending on how many classes you take and what they require. So in theory, open access textbooks are seen as an affordable alternative towards traditional textbooks. They offer much larger savings, and there's research been done on how much exactly it saves higher education students, which we'll get to in a second. And it can also drive down the traditional textbook prices. So there's a talk in the Q&A in Nathan's presentation about how the publishers are kind of creating a monopoly, right? 5 companies have 85% of the space. And while, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but as Mr. John explained, yes, a lot of publishing companies are experiencing financial troubles right now, and that may be reflected in the price of textbooks. But as more open access textbooks kind of flood the market, it also does drive down the incentive and the price for the textbook itself. So not only could open access help us in general get access to free textbooks that have been proven to be quality assured and interactive, but on that same token, as open access becomes more and more powerful and more people know about it, it kind of introduces new actors into the game, and that's how you defeat a monopoly, by putting more and more actors with smaller barriers to entry. So as open access becomes more and more important and recognized across the country, across the schools, it can also drive down traditional textbook prices. So the Student Public Interest Research Group, or the SPIRG, did a research report in 2012, and the conclusion was that on average, college students save 80% on textbooks compared to open access versus traditional textbooks. So that's the one glancing figure, is that we are getting textbooks at a significantly cheaper cost, primarily because they're free. And so a lot of states across the country, Florida, Ohio, Texas, California, have all taken initiatives to kind of promote open access within their learning environments. The Florida State Legislature, for example, also conducted an investigative report in 2012 that kind of talked about the benefits of open access, what they can do. So the conclusion came out by saying open access textbooks, without doubt, show improved quality, improved flexibility, and access to resources. So since 2012, and a little bit before that, open access right now is gaining ground across the education system in America, primarily because they so drastically reduce costs that are a major controversy. The majority of people, as Nathan talked about, low-income students, can't afford to pay textbooks, and for people who, even if they call their parents, the majority of textbooks we don't use, that we buy, rather, sometimes we don't tend to use. Speaking from personal experience, I know that in my college career, I have bought textbooks that have said required on the Mason Library's page, or the Patriot web page, but I've never ended up touching it for the whole year. And especially if you buy that new, and if rental isn't available, when you sell it back, the price is significantly lower. I could end up paying $350 or $400 on textbooks, and if I'm lucky, maybe get like $30 to $50 back at the end of the year. So cost is especially one really big controversy associated with why open access is seeking to supplant traditional textbook models. Next up is access issues. So this comes from the theory of textbooks themselves. Textbooks are books, and they're pretty large, and they're pretty heavy. This is a much bigger problem when we were in 9th grade than we are now. because it would be really heavy to carry all those textbooks and it would be really hard to lug them around everywhere. Now, hopefully we're all able to do that to a better degree, but it also presents a problem because what if you don't have your textbook? What if you forgot your textbook at home, or if you didn't bring it to class and you needed it, say, for an open note test? This happened to me a couple weeks ago. Professor allowed me to use open notes on a test, conveniently forgot my textbook. So traditional textbooks pose certain problems in that they're either hard copies, they either don't have downloadable online versions, or you can either just get one. If you buy the hard copy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get an online code where you can download the digital format for free or for use whenever you want. So this is the first place where open access provides a good solution towards the traditional textbook problems, is that it's accessible anywhere, right? So you can have audiobooks, you can have e-files, you can print the book if you want, and they, again, are little to no cost. So once you have access to the book, you have access to that book in multiple formats, meaning that you can literally have it on whatever multimedia device that you use, or if you don't have a multimedia device, find a way to print it through university resources to keep on hand. So because traditional textbooks are less accessible and less easy to access wherever you are, whenever you need them, open access provides a good solution towards a lot of the access issues that textbooks face. So the next problem, and arguably one of the biggest problems of traditional textbooks, is that the frequency of which we find new editions. A lot of the kids in the back, the COM 100 kids, will know this too well, and so will I, is that every year, or every semester rather, I believe, a new edition for the book comes out. So for COM 100, that textbook is $100, if I'm not mistaken. But when you sell it, you get 1 cent, because next semester, no one really cares about the 9th edition when the 10th edition's out. It's like the newest iPhone. So the majority of teachers find problems with this because they have to constantly get updated versions to kind of match their curriculum, and the students have to constantly have updated versions to match what the teacher is teaching, because the format in which it's explained is not the same. So open access textbooks and open textbooks have found a unique way of solving this problem, and it's because it's licensed to allow modification by instructors. So another thing Nathan mentioned in his presentation was that it's one professor, for example, like an economics professor who's an expert in the field, teaching at Georgetown, will write a book, and other economics professors or other experts in the field will contribute and have, this one collective holy grail textbook about the basics of economics and supply and demand. So rather than change the curriculum every year, open access is licensed to allow instructors to modify whatever materials they feel don't contribute to the overall learning objective, might be too difficult for students. Even if they, for example, are not comfortable teaching the material, it allows them to modify it or even remove it completely from their curriculum. Branching off Nathan, a problem with that is that a majority of professors and instructors around the world are then burdened sometimes with updating course requirements and updating their curriculum to match the textbooks. But because open access textbooks are growing as a community, we'll get more updated versions disseminated relatively quickly. One thing about open access is that it's still in the inception stages. We're still planning out how it can properly be assimilated into the American education system, which has used textbooks so long. And so while it has the potential to be revolutionary, we're still in the stages of trying to figure out how that works, getting the initial people who are interested in the academia to enter and show commitment to it, and which is why open access has relied so heavily on philanthropy and professors taking time out of their lives to write textbooks, and other professors across the country trying to edit those textbooks. So as open access becomes more and more recognizable and more funded, it kind of brings a larger pool of people in that academic field that are then willing to contribute to the book so that the information can be disseminated in an efficient and relatively updated manner. controversy also lies in the fact that, well, these authors aren't paid. The book is free, and so there's no real model so far for how the authors get paid. And again, this is a consequence of the fact that open access is still trying to figure out a bunch of these systemic problems with supplanting the traditional textbook models. There was an article on CNN about how certain open access involved organizations are seeking to maybe give authors royalties if their textbooks are sent out to different universities and printed, maybe like a certain amount of the print royalty goes towards the authors. And there's no like defined solution yet, but they're working on it. So open access helps modernize a lot of the textbooks because it's free-flowing information. So it allows you to modify the instructions whenever you want and the curriculum for the instructors teaching the material. And a major application to the current field of academia is the fact that textbooks tend to publish relatively controversial things. In college, this isn't that big of a problem, but in high school across the country or K through 12 education, there have been certain issues where textbooks might have covered it, not necessarily in the most unbiased or nonpartisan way. A good example of that is the teaching of creationism versus evolution. There's major controversy in Texas, the Texas State Board of Education, which approves the curriculum and approves the textbooks that are given out, essentially was not okay with how creationism was being explained and believed should have been a bigger emphasis on the teachings of evolution, which of course were a little bit controversial because favoring that side without proper justification tends to bring controversy in the area. There are also teachings on religious history, social issues movements, that textbooks, traditional textbooks, have generally been caught in the past publishing relatively controversial material. So because open access and its ability to modify the instructions and the materials in the textbook is so important, it assuages a lot of the concerns that the textbooks, either in higher education or K through 12 education, might be a little less controversial. We're getting a larger community in America, an academic community, to kind of peer review and add their own modifications to it, of textbooks. So it's not one publisher or one or two authors providing one focus. It's that naturally when you expand the field to different qualified professionals in the area, researching and peer reviewing it, you generally get the most unbiased, the most logically phrased and educational means of presenting that information. Open access textbooks also allow you to use like multimedia or different different supplementary information and ideas to kind of help promote the teaching environment. So not only does it help license to revise a lot of the material in textbooks, but it could also assuage a lot of the controversy that textbooks are associated with, and provides like multimedia tools, supplementary lectures, and online notes to kind of help provide a more holistic focus to what's being taught. So in conclusion, to wrap it up, there are 4 major controversies with open access textbooks. We have cost, we have access, modernization, and publishing controversies. And open access has a unique way of assuaging all 4 of those concerns. And so while in the future the open access revolution, in my opinion, will take over American education, there are still significant concerns we have to developing the fundamentals of open access, how we get funding, how people get paid, how textbooks continually become updated, and how teachers will really use them in the environment. But where it's at right now, open access has the potential to throw American education into a new era. So yeah, that's it.
Got time for 2 questions?
According to you guys, open access is or might be a solution to high cost of textbooks, probably in time. But don't you think once it's well accepted, it's going to find its way to make a profit just like the textbooks publishers are making right
I think once that happens, you kind of ruin the point of open access. I think the reason why open access is being brought to the table right now is because of the fact that publishers are taking advantage of the market. So it doesn't really make sense to invest all this time and all this money into this project that if it succeeds, then publishers would get a foothold of. I think that the way open access is defeating the traditional publishing model, it'll make it hard for publishers to kind of get a foothold in open access or dominate the market like they are right now when open access is working to defeat what's the status quo right now.
Any other questions for AK? All right, Sam, you want to go?
Great, we're kind of running low on time, so hold on to your seats, folks. We're going to be fast and furious. So the Pew Research Center back in January of this year, because they're so curious, found that 47% of college-aged individuals, so anyone between the age of about 18 to 25, were reading more books online than they were reading in person. And this just goes for overall books. And that's up actually from roughly 31% back in 2012. And so the prominence of online or ebooks has been surging within the past few years. And this is becoming more and more true in an educational sphere as well. And because open access materials are largely available online rather than in print, it becomes this question of whether or not print or online textbooks are the proper way to be advancing as education continues moving forward, which sort of leads me to my topic and the couple of questions that I was looking to answer today, and that's, should the ebook revolution be taking advantage of these open access materials, and if they do that, then what sort of impact does that have on the educational experience vis-a-vis these sort of online enhancements that AK was talking about earlier, and how open access can sort of play into that. So first, adopting this open access plan would actually increase education's effectiveness, or it has that potential. So you have these universities, sort of like what Nathan was talking about, like Oregon State University, which has started a more open access plan for several of its more popular courses. For some reason, geology is their most popular course, and so they have an online textbook that's been written open access by a couple of their professors there. And although it was written in-house by their professors, it doesn't put pressure on them to be the only ones that are editing this textbook, as was a concern that was brought up earlier. Instead, it allows them to sort of help tailor this textbook to the curriculum they want to be teaching, and to help that curriculum then be spread to other universities as well. So at Oregon State, clearly they have this really good geology program because it's really popular. But they're able to then use these online access and open access materials as an easier way of tailoring them more to their own educational experience that they want to be putting forward. Because as AK was saying, the fact that textbooks need to be updated so frequently when they're in print, if we have these online ebooks that are open access and therefore openly accessible, then we have the potential to be tailoring them much more towards the experiences, particularly when there are courses, even when they use print textbooks, that are moving much more towards an online experience. So for example, if anyone's taken a foreign language, I know here at Mason especially, we love having the online enhancement for those courses as well. This is particularly true for like Spanish classes. You have all of the online homeworks that they do and the exercises that help to further those. And I don't know if that extends to other languages as well, but I know it's a big thing that they do in the Spanish department. But it just gives them more of an ability to use these online materials in a more accessible and tailored way to their specific curriculum that they want to be doing. And then second, print textbooks are becoming obsolete largely because of the reasons that were said earlier. Costs are being seen by most students, and Forbes of October 30th of last year said that 30% of textbook sales were now happening in ebook form, largely because people don't want to pay the higher costs of having the print textbook, especially because even though the resale portion was brought up earlier, we as college students understand that we're not going to get our full investment back, and so rentals have increased. Ebooks have increased because we don't see the sellback as a prominent selling point for buying our own hard copy of a textbook. We instead see that as something that's not really an incentive anymore, because by the time that we turn in and sell our textbook, chances are we're going to get 1/10 of what we paid for it at best. And although this could potentially shift authors away from writing textbooks, because having them in print copy can offer slight commissions sometimes. It's not the most profitable industry, but it does offer a commission occasionally. It could potentially push them to be writing more towards academic journals. However, by providing these open access materials, places like the State University of New York have been encouraging their faculty members to be publishing more textbook material rather than journals for open access purposes, because it allows them to be publishing more freely from these large publishing companies. And we've been talking about the fact that there's 5 companies that hold 85% of the market, and that means that they control the type of material that you can put in the textbook as well. But publishing open access, particularly at your specific university, grants far more autonomy to professors to be writing the type of material and in the certain style that they want to. So rather than having to be constricted to these sorts of formats that most publishing companies fall into, they're able to go out and write as they would like to, and so they have a greater sense of autonomy, which incentivizes people to be writing further and further for these textbooks, because you don't have these peer review blocks, you don't have as many publishing company blocks, you instead have the ability to spread and dilute the information as much as possible. Dilute's not the right word, disperse, that's the word. And then the fact that we would have an economic impact occur in a positive sense for students would overall help increase student morale in the classroom. The Wall Street Journal from this year, in August of 2014, notes that books are becoming more expensive, so people are naturally making this shift to ebooks. But because there's such a high cost of textbooks, and because many professors, and I've had this happen before, only use the textbooks maybe once or twice, you're having this sort of sense between students and professors become almost an animosity at times, when we have a feeling that maybe we're not getting everything that we should from a so-and-so required reading. However, if we move towards a more open access material, then that gives professors much more freedom of picking whichever readings they want to, whether it only be 1 or 2 chapters, and having the students still maintain a positive image towards them, rather than seeing them as someone who was like, you made me spend $200 on a textbook that I didn't even end up using, which does often happen for many students. And although we know that professors try to do as much as they can with them, sometimes it just happens that we don't end up using the material as much as we needed to, and it avoids any sort of unintended animosity that occurs between students and professors, and allows for a much more amicable learning environment. Now, the one downside of open access, because it is something that is funded by universities and is a free service, it could potentially raise overall university costs if universities decide to roll this into tuition. However, studies have shown that students are overall more willing to pay more for a tuition, since it's already such a large sum, than pay more for these smaller sums along the way. Also, the fact that tuition has more opportunities for scholarship to help cover some of these increased costs, that's the word, sorry, my brain's going everywhere. To help cover some of these increased costs, rather than, we don't really have textbook scholarships that occur for us, but we do have scholarships that can come in smaller amounts. So we can still help to cover that increased cost, and so it helps to increase our overall morale towards the university and higher education as well. But this also has an impact beyond college, because Business Week of October 4th of 2014 notes there are a couple of California school districts, because they're so economically advantaged right now, even though California's broke, that are starting to supply iPads in the classroom as a way of adding these online materials to let them be used more frequently, and have especially these online enhancements for these textbooks. And so by using those at a K through 12 level, we're able to foster more use of these online enhancements, which prepares people to be using them even more effectively by the time that they get to universities. Nathan's already gone over the fact that the digital divide does exist, but even at this public education level, if we're able to overcome it there, then we have the potential of making open access something even greater to be used at higher education, which, I mean, as college students and college professors, we all have a great incentive to be pushing for. So while the ebook revolution is sort of coming along, it's important to be keeping open access in mind, because it will play a key role in whether or not ebooks become the new sort of frontier for use in the classroom.
Questions for Sam?
So why not just go back to the old course pack?
Can you explain the course pack?
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry.
Your professor selects readings
Mm-hmm.
and then submits those readings to the print services office. They compile them, you pay the royalties on that content, and the student still, is paying,
Mhm.
but you're not paying for the whole textbook. I'd really like to know, do y'all feel that's more, sorry, I don't mean to hijack your conversation, but do you feel that's more reasonable and worthwhile? I see some nods. I want to hear a resounding yes or no. Yes, okay. So, what if textbooks, instead of being this traditional tome written by, a couple of people or whatever, you had readings that were divided by chapter and then sold by chapter? So that then there are actually, it does sound like we're sort of dinging on the publishers, but they do offer a service. The service being copy editing. Believe me, if you've seen some PhD writers, it can be really scary. So copy editing is very important. I don't know if indexing is anymore because we can do keyword searching if it's in electronic format, but let's say indexing to some degree, and also availability in other databases or whatever. So would that be acceptable to you as a student? Yeah? Okay, so that's a model that you would be interested in purchasing. So what is your biggest angst?
To hijack the conversation again, I think, so I think that this actually method might be a way to sort of incorporate, we talked about how maybe print can be incorporated with open access earlier, and Nathan kind of discussed that and touched on it a little bit. But this sort of format, I think, provides a better way to be using open access both in print and online, because as Nathan did discuss earlier, he did mention that people preferred reading their textbooks in print, even though ebooks are becoming more popular largely because of an economic concern. But if you offer them online, open access, free of charge, with the option of getting the material that you need for a class in print for these course materials at a reduced price of what a normal textbook would be, that's sort of a way to kind of come to a consensus of both print and online being used as an open access sort of synergistic model. And I don't know if that was necessarily where you were going with it, but I just hijacked the conversation back to where I wanted to go, I guess.
Well, that content's not open access, so they pay no royalties for it.
Right.
Other questions?
I'd like to know why. I understand that textbooks are expensive, but I'd like to know why students feel that they should, in particularly, be free. Like all students, or almost all students, have iPhones or these Nokia phones. Nobody expects those to be free. Almost all students probably have cable TV at home. You're not expecting that to be free. So why should textbooks be free? Why don't you expect a free iPhone from Apple? Apple's a monopoly too. So.
I think that it's a large portion of the higher cost of higher education as well. We see a tuition rise, and then we also see a textbook cost rise, and we say, well, I'm already paying more to go to school. Why do I then have to pay more for this specific class? And so I think that it just becomes a large economic driver. I think that's the biggest thing that's driving much of the open access conversation is the economic burden that higher education does tend to place on students. And we're still young, and we don't necessarily think of it objectively. We see the cost that's directly in front of us and say, well, why am I paying $200 for a textbook, not realizing that that's like sort of just a chink in what we're paying overall, or what impact that will have on our future earnings, etc.
Can I add a comment to that, or are we running out of time?
Go ahead.
I also think that it's also like a little bit matter of luxury when comparing the two things. Like I can choose to get a brick phone if I want, a Nokia that will never break, and I can get through life just fine. Buying an iPhone is a luxury that I choose to invest in. right? When we're going to education, when the textbook essentially sometimes depends on whether you fail or pass a class, and you're paying more for that, that is where the problem comes in, combined with the fact that if we don't use the textbooks and the resale value of it too, it's just that a lot of students, I feel, don't feel that they're getting the full value out of the textbook for what they pay. I use my phone every day, and so that $150 has already paid its way back. But for textbooks, if I only touch it once and I pay $150 for it, that's my return on it.
So maybe that's the answer, read your textbook.
I think that the final, or my comment on that would be that, you know, I've paid for an iPhone, I've paid for an iPad. I use Google God knows how many dozens of times a day. I've never paid a cent to Google anything. You know, my generation comes from this mindset that information should be accessible, that it always has been accessible for us. You know, I've never really found something in a history textbook that I couldn't look up online, you know, without paying for it. But obviously, we've never been handed free iPhones from Wikipedia before. So I think that there is, and you know, for better or for worse, there's this generational divide where we not only don't expect to pay for information, we expect not to pay for information.
So also you resent the churn the publisher does on editions,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Well, to piggyback off of that, we're expected to buy, I know for one of my classes, I needed 4 textbooks. That was a cost totaling, I think $100 to most of the books I could buy at Barnes & Noble. But if I had to buy 4 textbooks in the past for like $150 a book, which I've had to do, that's just for that class. And if all of my 5 professors here at Mason, or 6 professors, mandate a textbook that's $150 that I'm only going to use in that course, that's a lot of money for that just one semester, and it rolls over each time, and they're not cross-applicable. So that's where the cell phone and laptop discussion really comes into handy, because I can use a cell phone for more than one class. I can use a cell phone for more than just school. I can use a laptop for more than just school and class.
All right, to the back and then to the front.
Like, to add to that too, like, I feel like our generation, like, we don't, like, we have to think more versus, like, a professor who's, like, teaching here, they could have got their education, like, 20, 30 years ago, and it's not going to cost nearly as much for them, like, textbook-wise, tuition-wise, but, like you guys said, like, the cost is rising drastically so much. That's why it's, like, impacting us, like, so much. More than, like, what it would versus, like, a professor who's teaching. They're not really going to understand it as much because they got their education 20-some years ago, so it's going to be a lot less for them, like, versus our generation.
When we got our education, we didn't have to pay for cell phones either.
Money becomes the foundational issue on many different levels here, many different levels. I completely buy the argument that those who are economically impoverished or challenged, especially at this, in student populations, it does become something that is almost insurmountable. The corollary to that is, in the academic world, in order to keep professors in academia and not have them flee to the private sector, there have to be additional incentives for why they should stay in the academic realm. And as such, you have some professors, especially in certain disciplines that don't tend to warrant significant salaries, who need something like the publishing of a textbook to be able to bring in additional monies to them so that they can stay in academia and they can continue to teach. So it's really a double-edged sword. And to be quite frank, as someone who, through a handshake with the president of the State Board of Education in the state of Texas, literally concretized a $14 billion textbook deal for K through 12, I understand the import of what it means for textbook, manufacturers to have that kind of influence, and it's a huge influence. $14 billion for one textbook, because there's 1,800 high schools in the state of Texas, and the estimate was that it would at least last for approximately 7 years. So there's the money import is huge here, right? It's huge for those who can't afford the textbooks. It's huge for the professors who are trying to use it as some type of salary supplement to warrant staying in the academic realm. It's huge because of the incredible pressure placed by the textbook manufacturers and publishers because of what they can and can't do with certain, institutions. And so you're all absolutely correct. It is a foundational discussion here. And I think the open access world is going to have to deal with the myriad levels that are involved in the money issue here in order for it to flourish and in order for those who desperately need these textbooks to not have to pay inordinate sums. Because yes, maybe they shouldn't be free, but I totally agree with everybody who's commented in this room that paying hundreds of dollars for certain textbooks is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, so just to close things up, going off what Peter said, money issues underlie everything here, and I think that's why open access textbooks are so much of a paradigm shift, because it takes the idea of knowledge, it takes the idea of using a text to educate in a university setting, and it takes the dollar sign off of it. For better or for worse, I don't think anybody can really stop it. That eventually the incentives to move towards open access and electronic text are just too strong. And with that, I think we'll wrap up.
Please join me in thanking you gained some knowledge, not only about open access textbooks, but open access in general. Please help yourself to swag and whatever food is left. And thank you so much for coming.